So thank you. Let's turn to our first session for our opening keynote address to really set the stage and frame the discussion. We're delighted to have Alan Beattie join us. Alan, I'm sure probably everyone in this room reads. He's the senior trade writer at the Financial Times and writes the weekly Trade Secrets newsletter, a must-read. We were joking earlier how hard it is to come up with clever names for newsletters and podcasts, but Trade Secrets was one of the first, so he's got a great title. Alan's based in London. He was previously the FT's international economy editor, and before that, he was an economist at the Bank of England. His books include False Economy, A Popular Economic History of the World, and Who's in Charge Here?, an account of the mishandling of the global financial crisis. So we'll ask Alan to give us remarks. I'll then invite Emily Kilcrease from the Center for New American Security in Washington and Ziad Haidar from McKinsey & Company to join Alan on stage for a panel discussion. But first, please join me in welcoming Alan Beattie to the stage.
So good morning. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. And particularly speaking as a Brit resident in London, thank you for offering at least temporary respite from living in what is undoubtedly the worst governed country in the advanced democratic world at the moment. Just to keep you up to date on this, yesterday, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister campaigning in the general election, in all seriousness said the UK was far too dependent on imported food and everyone should buy British food instead. Why his government spent so much effort signing trade deals with agricultural exporters like Australia was left unspoken. But for those of you who are familiar with your history of trade and free trade, I've seen a lot of things in my life. A Conservative Prime Minister wanting to re-establish the Corn Laws, I have to say, was not among them. Now look, it's easy to see where the concept of economic security has come from, right? We have superpower tensions, which unlike the last Cold War, which was between one big economic superpower and what was basically an autarkic economic basket case, this time round between two huge competitive trading powers. And US-China tension has raised the issue and the stakes at a time of massive changes in technology and of the threat of climate change. So it's easy to see why we're talking about this. And it's easy enough to see, I'll get onto this in a second, what's being done in its name. What's harder, and I guess what we're going to spend the next day and a half talking about, is to define what it is, or what it should be, and what it's wise and logical and efficient to pursue doing it. So for sort of non-self-serving purposes, let's try for a sort of neutral definition, which I'll go is governments intervening in a variety of ways to manage the trade-off between trade and growth on the one hand and security on the other, usually responding to geopolitical risks or indeed to natural phenomena like climate change and pandemics, which these days often have and take on a sort of geopolitical aspect. You know, the expression of this was from Jens Stoltenberg of NATO in 2022, just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when he said, we must recognize, this is a quote, we must recognize that our economic choices have consequences for our security. Freedom is more important than free trade. The protection of our values is more important than profit. Now, I'm old enough to remember when those kind of interventions would have been based on quite a narrow definition of economic security. It was largely focused on traditional military-style security, military procurement, dual-use technology, other specialist areas of trade like that, which, frankly, people like me, from an economics background, writing about trade, rarely wrote about. You know, I did continually have contacts who had tried to persuade me to write about dual-use export controls and so forth. I always found it slightly tedious. I now wish I'd paid attention all those years, obviously. But over time, with this tension, with this geopolitical tension, this has now expanded into a wider view of which kind of technologies are actually strategic, right? So we started with a very narrow thing of military technology and dual use. Then it expanded into a wider view of what technologies are strategic, somewhat itself driven by technological change, the fact that there are semiconductors in everything, semiconductors from obviously very high security goods to low security goods, and the idea of strategic combat going beyond actual military combat towards cyber security and so forth. Then you had expands a bit more, because you have existing trade and commerce choke points, which have now become geopoliticized. The Suez Canal has always been there. It has been blocked before. But the blockage of the Suez Canal is now much more geopolitical. You also have choke points, in things such as undersea cables, gas pipelines, and satellites. Then it extends a bit further when you have inputs and products which themselves are bottlenecks in production, particularly critical materials like rare earths. Then, expanding it, you can see I'm going to run out of arm at some point, right? Then you have new high-tech, high-value technologies like EVs, which don't have necessarily direct national security implications, but are vastly important, have first-mover advantage, and maintenance of capacity in manufacturing. More conceptually, you expand in security threats of climate change and pandemics. And finally, the absolute outer limit, it encompasses the threat to civilization and democracy from substandard garlic. Now, in case you think I've gone mad from exposure to British politics, or it's the jet lag talking, I'm referring to Senator Rick Scott of the great state of Florida, who in all seriousness wants a complete and absolute import ban on Chinese garlic, because it is bad garlic, it makes Americans sick, and it will weaken American from within. So I think by this point, it's become clear that economic security is whatever unscrupulous governments, right, which is to say governments, redefine it to mean whatever they want it to mean. Now, it's acquired a whole bunch of buzz phrases, right? Decoupling, de-risking, open strategic autonomy, the EU one, which then, this is absolutely true, which then got compressed to strategic autonomy because the French expended a lot of energy and political capital cutting off open strategic autonomy. Strategic indispensability, small yard, high fence, securonomics, and economic statecraft. There are so many buzz phrases, and they cover so many things that by now we're sort of getting towards the attitude that was famously expressed by Justice Potter Stewart, who was a justice of the US Supreme Court. It was actually a First Amendment case, free speech case about obscenity, and asked to define obscenity, he said, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. So if we're going to try and look at it objectively, I think there are two frames which are useful to see government's actions is. One is the objective circumstances of countries, their economies, their geographical positions, their geopolitical importance, and what makes sense for them to do. The other is how institutions and politics, functionally or dysfunctionally, shape how they actually respond. Now, I want to drill down into a few examples now among the democracies. Obviously, you have China as a sort of limiting case of a country which will intervene anywhere and everywhere when it wants to. But within the democracies, I want to drill down into a few examples. And forgive me if this seems like I'm getting into an awful lot of technicalities or specificities very quickly, but I'm a journalist. We deal in examples, right? If I had the power of sustained, cogent, abstract thought, I'd have managed to go into academia or something else. Or the French civil service. We will start, of course we will, with Australia and China and coercion. Now, I'm saying this not just to curry favour with the audience, though there is that, and I'm emphatically not trying to Australia-splain what I recognise as a very complex situation to a largely Australian audience. But I can tell you what it looked like from outside, because there was intense, and I mean intense, interest in the China-Australia coercion episode, particularly in Brussels. This is not a very scientific metric, but my column earlier this year on China-Australia got the second highest number of hits on the website of anything I've written this year. So, from the objective circumstances, superficially, of course, Australia looks vulnerable. It's a small, open economy. It's highly dependent on Chinese demand. Go slightly closer in, and you realize that this is an economy that certainly in the goods like commodities, which China was trying to target, because they are commodities, it can switch exports relatively simply elsewhere. You can switch barley from Australia to Saudi. There are, of course, some commodities like iron ore, which China didn't feel it could actually blockade because it really needed them. Those sectors which were not necessarily commodities, Australia's export sector is famously smart and adaptable. The Australian winemakers finally had a good crack at breaking over the American wine market. And of course, the services exports, higher education exports, actually held up surprisingly well. But what's really striking, certainly was what was really striking if you look at it from Europe, was on the political side, that it really looked like a proper bipartisan political consensus that the country was going to take a hit. It was going to take a hit, and it was going to roll with the punch. And I remember talking to the, sadly now late, prematurely late Simon Crean on this in Brussels, and it would have been about 2022. And he sort of explained to me how, yes, there had been some divergence, there had been criticism from Labour, but actually Labour had come into alignment with the government. And I said, you know, are they basically working together now? Do they all agree? And he said, yeah, you can't really see a difference. He said, well, critically, China can't see a difference they can try and drive a wedge into. And once you have that kind of consensus, Australia as a country is quite well adapted to integrating and making the trade-offs between economics and national security. Because it has a unified government, it has a certain degree of centralization. Now, in case, again, anyone thinks I'm just describing this to dumb constitutional luck, I would say there is no guarantee, right, that a bicameral, mainly two-party parliamentary democracy with a relatively high degree of centralized power can run economic security or indeed any policy competently. Like I say, I've just come from the UK. Now, looking forward to what Australia is doing now, looking at the Made in Australia programme, rhetorically, I understand that it is a break with the past. Rhetorically, I understand this is a break with the Hawke-Keating consensus and the Hawke-Keating legacy. But there's a limited amount that really could be done to break with that legacy, certainly with regard to trade. I'd see it as not attempted, really, to put any trade restrictions on, which is a very good idea. And it's not a break with Hawke-Keating in the sense that, for example, Bidenomics is a break with Clintonomics. Speaking of which, let's go to the US. Now, the US has a history of defining national security to mean this is what I want to do at the time. This is not altogether a bad thing, right? I don't know if you know this, but not the whole way, but part of the way that Eisenhower got the interstate highway system built was pretending that it was a civil defense program that would allow America to evacuate its big cities in case of attack. Obviously bogus, but you know, it got the job done. And the US in some ways is objectively better placed than Australia is to insulate itself from the shocks from China and to compete with China. It's a big continental economy. It's more self-sufficient. It issues the world's only real international currency, meaning it has a weapon that it can use in terms of control of the dollar payment system, and it can borrow freely. It has a bigger fiscal capacity than anyone else. It has a gigantic military around the world, highly developed national security apparatus, and a global intelligence operation with allies, including the Five Eyes. But Joe Biden, unfortunately, is not Eisenhower, or indeed Harry S. Truman, which is a politician with whom he's sometimes compared. It's not entirely his fault, but it's not really his fault at all. But like Truman, Biden's instinct is to build international alliances. But at home, he faces, unlike Australia, a partisan divide over the very nature of national security, where the threat is from, which country the threat comes from, and what should be done about it. There is always the threat of Donald Trump. There is always the threat that in 6 months' time, you will have a president who doesn't regard Russia as an enemy at all, and who might get bamboozled into trying to do a deal with China rather than standing up to China. You can't really do friendshoring when you don't know who your friends are, or who your friends don't know whether or not you're going to be reliable. He is also limited in the usefulness of certain tools because of domestic political pressures. Trade is a very obvious one, and here I will, I'm afraid to say, dissent from what the Commerce Secretary says. The US has now had this toxic attitude towards trade and trade deals for some time. It couldn't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It can't join the successor, the CPTPP. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think, was a valiant attempt to create something within those very narrow confines in which it was able to work, but I think they were really quite narrow confines. And you have domestic pressure, particularly from manufacturing, and particularly from unionized manufacturing, which comes at a distinct tangent to national security needs. The Biden administration is trying to hit multiple goals at once. You can have a worker-centered trade policy, or you can have a trade policy that is built on building alliances. You cannot automatically have both. So one of the things that Biden inherited from Trump on the trade area, and one of the things that they've expended a lot of political capital doing, is national security tariffs on steel and aluminium, the so-called Section 232 tariffs. These, of course, are imposed on long-standing foreign policy allies, including the European Union, including Japan. This really doesn't look like using trade policy for security at all. You are honestly thinking about economic security, and you're putting tariffs on basic commodities. This is nothing to do with tariff building. This is about winning Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in the general election. So turning to Europe, I was about to say the EU has less toxic politics, but then that was before last week. And you see the election, and the big threat in Europe, of course, is often Russia rather than China, of Russophiles like Marine Le Pen. Now, the EU's problem. Like the US, it's more economic self-sufficient than Australia. Not as much as the US. It's more intertwined with China. It has a lot of car industry, for example, invested in China, and it's much harder to shift a Volkswagen plant out of China than it is to redirect barley exports from China to Saudi Arabia. But even more so, politically speaking, it has divisions of power at very different levels. There are divisions of power between the EU collectively and the member states individually. It is much harder to get consensus, even if there aren't big ideological differences. Foreign direct investment screening has been very efficiently done in Australia, and national security has been intertwined with economic policy. In the EU, it's a bit of a shambles. National security remains at a member state level. Even if you wanted to share secret classified information with the likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary, you cannot organize this collectively because there is no real means, they say there is, but there is no real means of doing so. I know that the National Director of Australian Intelligence will be speaking at this conference later today. If this conference would be held in Brussels, you would not have the Director of EU Intelligence, and that is because nobody knows who they are. And I'm not just being flippant, and I'm not being offensive by saying that. It is that there is someone who does this job. I asked, in preparation for this speech, a whole bunch of old Brussels hands, including reporters who report on defense and security policy. Only about half of them knew there was such a person, and not one of them could name them. They don't really have any power. And so you have a political fracture dealing with China. Now, nature abhors a vacuum, right, is the old expression. Nature has obviously not seen much of the European Union, where vacuums can endure for decades on end. But there is one, let me just go slightly into the weeds on this, because there's one really interesting episode going on at the moment, which I think is insufficiently noticed outside, which is this. The EU has acquired a new regulation against foreign subsidies, right? Nothing to do with national security. It's about subsidized, distorted competition within the EU. And it's run by the Competition Directorate. They recently organized a dawn raid on a company called Nuctec, a Chinese company which makes baggage scanners and human scanners for airports. They say it's subsidized, but of course, they actually are fairly blatant about saying, oh yeah, we went after them because there's a political dimension. The company used to be run by Hu Jintao's son, and because of this long-running suspicion that Nuctec was collecting personal data and commercial data and funneling it back to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that may be all very well, but last time I looked, when you run national security, you want national security people to do it. You don't really want a bunch of antitrust nerds in the Competition Directorate, right, freelancing on the basis of what they've heard somewhere might be a good idea. It's always reminded me a bit like, a bit like when they nailed Al Capone. You know, they got Al Capone for tax evasion eventually, right? I mean, I'm sure he was guilty of tax evasion, but right, that wasn't exactly the point, was it? And if you look at the other countries rather, other countries I know less about, Japan I know less about, but one thing I do find interesting about Japan is it does seem to have this attachment, continuing attachment to international and multilateral frameworks, a trust in the G7 process, a trust in the WTO, and so forth, which I fear maybe is very admirable. I fear maybe over-optimistic over time. Now, between these big behemoths, as we know, there's this big mass of countries who define themselves as being non-aligned, who trade the US off against China, one big power off against another. It's because of those countries I'm reasonably confident, less so than I was a few years ago, but I'm reasonably confident that the economic security drive is not going to pull the world economy apart. It's not going to split into spheres. There are too many countries which want to keep in with both camps in order for that to happen. Now, there's an old saying, right, which is, I don't have a solution, but I do admire the problem. And that's essentially where I am with economic securities. I don't have a solution, but I do very much admire the problem. And I'm very much looking forward to spending the next day and a half hearing from much better informed people than I am what solutions they have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. You can take a seat in the middle. Ziad and Emily. Well, thank you very much, Alan. That was outstanding. We will do our best to find the solution by tomorrow at 1 p.m. I want to reassure the audience that at lunch we are only serving secure Australian garlic. Let's now unpack a lot of what Alan talked about to set the scene for the rest of the conference. So Emily Kilcrease joins us from Washington, D.C., from the Center for New American Security. She's the director there of the Energy Economics and Security Program. She's held positions in USTR, U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the National Security Council, and the Department of Commerce. She is an expert on the toolkit of investment screening and export controls that Alan said he wished he'd studied more. So we have an opportunity to look at that toolkit. And also Ziad Haidar, who is partner and global director of geopolitical risk at McKinsey & Company. He's based in Singapore, has extensive experience at senior levels in the US government and in business. I might start with you, Emily, on this question of deglobalization, reglobalization, friendshoring. From a Washington perspective, Ziad and I are also Washingtonians, but we're not in Washington anymore. From a Washington perspective, what do you see on the ground? What is the intent of the administration's strategy on investment screening, export controls, small paddocks and high fences? And what are the politics? Because the politics, if you're in Australia or Singapore, look a little scary. The policy looks somewhat rational. So how would you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I think where I would start with that is that there's a core of the economic security agenda that feels non-optional in Washington, D.C. When we're talking about things like export controls on advanced chips, advanced technologies, having a very robust CFIUS or investment screening process, or even some of the industrial policy that we're seeing, particularly around chips, where there's largely bipartisan consensus, not complete, but largely bipartisan consensus on the need to support those industries. There's a political consensus and a policy consensus that these are just actions that the government needs to take. But I think once you get beyond that sort of essential area of economic security, that's where the politics starts to come into play. And I think there's a bit of a danger when we start to break open this toolkit and we have a relatively unchecked executive power to use the economic security toolkit, because that is essentially what we have in the United States, whether it's the IEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the 232 tariffs, or the 301 tariffs, or there's a very long list of things that we could talk about. That is something that the executive can largely do on their own. So once you start to go down that path, it's quite easy to lose discipline. And it's quite easy to let the political elements come into play. And I think one of the biggest examples of this in the US political process right now is the president's stated public opposition to the Nippon Steel acquisition of US Steel, where he's been very careful to say he's not making a national security argument, but when you look at the tools available to how you would actually block that deal, it is only really a national security process that could block it. And so I think what we've seen is this genuine security-driven element of the economic security agenda where the government feels like it has no choice. It has to protect these industries. It has to maintain US leadership because we don't see another way to maintain advantage in the strategic competition with China. But then there's the creep. And it's the creep, I think, that is worthy of further conversation, including over the next day or two in terms of how we discipline that, how we align approaches with key partners and allies, and then how we think about the question of evaluation. And this is something I hope we'll come back to. But we're using all sorts of innovative, creative policy tools now, including layering tools into particular sectors. CHIPS is a good example of that. We have no idea if any of this is going to work. And politically, maybe we don't care. At least until November, perhaps we don't care. But at some point, we need to have a real robust sense of, do these tools work? Are they actually achieving both the economic and security objectives we set out?
So the US has had an economic security strategy since Alexander Hamilton. It just comes in different forms and different iterations, sometimes for very convenient reasons, as Alan pointed out. Would you describe the current economic security framing in Washington as reactive or something that's been there that is now being implemented because the politics are allowing it?
I think there's elements of both being reactive and proactive. I mean, when you talk about the advanced technology controls and all the things we're doing in the context of managing the relationship with China, administration officials are very careful to frame that as reactive, right? Like we're doing advanced chip controls because China is engaging in military civil fusion, because they're being incredibly aggressive in their region, because they are a threat, and we do not think that we can work with them as a responsible stakeholder. So that is very much framed as we don't have a choice. We have to take these measures because we have no other way to deal with China. So it's a very defensive kind of posture there. But then if you look at, for example, clean energy, that's much more proactive, right? And particularly when you look at things like the 301 tariffs that we just imposed on electric vehicles, on batteries, that's actually trying to get ahead of the curve a little bit. We're saying we want to build this industry in the United States. We don't have this industry in the United States. And so we're taking a range of policy measures, including industrial policy support, including the tariffs to protect this infant industry, if we may use that term in the US context, to try to get ahead of the curve in some of these kind of catch-up technology areas.
And before I turn to Ziad for how it looks to business, what are the checks and balances? You know, this catnip of protectionism that's always been there. When I was in the NSC, in the George W. Bush administration running the Asia office, there were a number of really important checks on this. I mean, the president himself came out of a traditional Republican free trade ideology. But you also had the Treasury Department, which was quite powerful, sort of speaking up for the free markets and the prevailing Washington consensus. The Chamber of Commerce and business associations, and especially farmers and ranchers, for Republicans at least. Really powerful checks, and allies, which as often as I say it in Sydney and Canberra, I don't know if people believe me, but allies do have a vote in this debate in Washington. How would you describe the sort of checks on that catnip that exists in all the executive authorities the president can draw on?
Yeah, let me take those piece by piece. So in terms of the interagency process, there's been a fundamental shift over the last 5 to 6 years in how the interagency process works, where traditionally you had agencies like Commerce, for example, that was more on the industry side. But now when you look at what Commerce is really focused on, it's on the economic security toolkit. It's on the restrictions, right? So they're playing a fundamentally different role in the interagency process. USTR is also playing a fundamentally different role. One might ask what it is in the interagency process, but fundamentally different, right? So you have kind of this pretty profound shift toward the security elements within the interagency. So that kind of inherent internal government check isn't there. We also have the potential for a legislative check. Well, Congress can do some things every once in a while. They managed to pass a bill to ban TikTok, but that's about it, right? We've been talking about outbound investment controls for multiple years, and there still isn't even a coherent approach on Congress on what that would look like. So Congress isn't really playing much of a check in this area of economic restrictions where the executive legally does have quite a bit of flexibility and autonomy to act. Industry is a much less prevalent voice. They're still complaining quite a bit about some of these restrictions, but their natural in through the Republican Party is just not what it used to be as well. And so you have much less kind of in the political economy of DC pushing back on these sorts of restrictions. And so you do have an executive that can move forward with a good amount of independence. The last point I'll add on this, there's a really interesting report that some folks might be familiar with in terms of looking at popular opinion around some of the tariffs that were taken under the Trump administration. And it found that even in those communities that were most impacted negatively by the tariffs, their political support for the Trump administration actually went up. So there's a bit of this disconnect too in terms of that's not a check either, because the economic impact is separated from kind of the political impact of some of these actions as well. So you don't have like a groundswell of support for a more reasoned approach coming from the communities that are most affected by these policies.
I think we'll come back to this, not just for the US, but for the EU, for Korea and Japan, and even for Australia. The fragmentation is not just markets and deglobalization, it's fragmentation of political consensus in the major economies that have shaped the Washington Consensus. And I asked about reaction in the hope I could get you to say the C word, not Canada. Although much of US trade policy is in reaction to Canada, I have to say. Yeah. But China really, I think, drove this. But Japan, too. I have been here for 2 years, and the earliest sort of thought leadership and debates about export controls, investment screening in 2010, 11, 12 were very quietly happening because Japanese officials were coming to Washington after Japan was embargoed in 2010. So there's many fathers of this mess. Ziad, you are the go-to person for a lot of companies trying to make sense of this. And I want to ask you later about how you reassure companies and how you advise them. But first, what do you see on the ground? What does the data tell you? What do the anecdotal interactions with the private sector tell you about the actual impact on firm strategies, on markets, on the global economy?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Mike. And firstly, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm based in Singapore, so not too far a hop to make, but nonetheless, congratulations, Mike and John, on an excellent event. I mean, the lineup is fantastic, so kudos to you both. I think go-to is a heavy title, Mike. We're all trying to make sense of a world that seems to be in a rather messy transition. I think the frame that keeps coming up in my conversations with CEOs and boards is a paradoxical one. On one hand, many companies do believe, and maybe they've grown up to believe in the importance of connectivity, obviously with caution, with clear-eyedness about concentration risks. But at the same time, there's a sense that connectivity is getting paired with an increasingly contested global order. And the mind typically focuses on one aspect of that contestation, which is the US-China question. But that is only one level of the geopolitical turmoil that companies are grappling with. And I think it's worth just unpacking a few other levels to really round out and scene set the conversation. At the highest level, yes, it's of course this sort of evolving strategic competition due to China's reemergence on the global stage, not rise, but return to the global stage from a historical point of view. Of course, alongside the conflict in Europe and in the Middle East. So those are the kind of big three gray rhinos, as we put them, the known risks of high impact charging the global landscape where companies are trying to figure out how to get out of the way. And I don't use that term to minimize the human suffering around these conflicts. But those are the big three that the mind goes to. Thereafter, of course, again, the mind does go to the fact that we're in a year of an extremely high number of elections. Elections can be moments of continuity, or they can be moments of discontinuity on a spectrum. And so obviously many companies are trying to think through what are the implications of these, including for the kinds of industrial policies that we've been and will be discussing over the next day and a half. A lot of emphasis has been placed on the decisions made by certain governments, for example, in this region, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and so on, from a security and economic lens. But the politics of these countries are challenged, to say the least, as they are elsewhere. So what direction does all of that go, depending on the outcome of an election, weighs heavily on business minds. But let's just go a little bit lower, because at some point for a company, particularly if it has big capex, facilities, factories, geopolitical risk boils down very quickly to where is that factory and is it in a hot zone. And in that regard, we too empirically see that the world is much more contested, right? We had last year 59 conflicts involving states on one side of the conflict. That's the highest number since the end of World War II. That level of conflict also triggered mass amounts of displacement, 120 million people, double the number from a decade ago. That's roughly the size of the population of Japan dispersed globally. And again, if you're in a Myanmar, if you're in a Sudan, where 10 million people are internally displaced as we speak, that matters a lot to you as a company, as your unit of geopolitical risk, if you have facilities in these places and so on. And even short of facilities, if there's a conflict and you can't put your money out, think Sri Lanka or Pakistan, right? And so beneath all of these layers, the kind of gray rhinos, the elections, the conflict and displacement, you have something even deeper that Alan alluded to, which is the sense of these tectonic plate shifts happening towards a much more multipolar world. What do we mean by that? I think the Indian External Affairs Minister put it well when he said, at the end of World War II, there were only 50 states. Today, there are 200 plus states. Can the rules of that era hold up and be the guarantor of stability in this era? And I think the answer for many people would probably be no. As a result, many of those countries, which we sometimes refer to as the middle powers or some other artful term, are going to exercise greater agency. That is a good thing in some ways, but it also means a more volatile world. That is opportunity for businesses about how will these middle powers align, right? Alan mentioned that might even provide a ballast to the global economy. On the other hand, it does mean that their attempts to prosecute their own agenda and interests in places like Africa and other places are going to be at cross purposes, which means more volatility. So long way of saying, Mike, that I think we should think about geopolitical turmoil in a more empirical and in a more layered way than just the China question, because for companies, their unit of analysis is in part going to depend on their exposure, and that could be quite market specific, but we're in a moment that transcends just the China question in terms of where we are in the world.
And let me just mention to the audience, if we have time, we'll have a mic for a question or two before we wrap up if you want to start thinking about that. I particularly appreciate, Ziad, your point about the multipolarity of this. It's true for business, it's true for national security and defense too. We are not in a bipolar US-China world. We're in a much more complicated world where states have agency and where their decisions and their security, whether they're net exporters of security or danger, matter a lot. It's not all just what happens in Beijing and Washington. You make an important point also about political risk. A lot of what you're describing, the Myanmar scenario, the Middle East, the Ukraine war, is what 20 years ago we would have recognized as political risk.
Right.
It's just more intense and there's more of it.
Yep.
How are you finding firms and business leaders are responding to the other dimension that Alan focused on, which is decisions by those in the conning tower in the G7 to change the way economic statecraft happens and the role of government? Do you find that business leaders are resigned to it, see opportunity, are fighting it?
Yeah.
You can't do this. This is bad for profits. How would you describe, without naming names unless you want to, the sort of general tone of the discussions with clients and businesses you meet?
Well, I think it's a reality that many companies now have to deal with, that there is an expectation from their home governments that they will exercise some form of, I'll put it this way, corporate geopolitical responsibility. But their ability to exercise it after a point is going to depend on their exposure, how heavily invested they are in a particular market or so on. So yes, on one hand, industrial policy is a huge opportunity for not just companies of that country, but others. If we look at the way the Korean and Japanese players, for example, look at the IRA and the CHIPS Act, that's tremendous opportunity for them in many ways, right? On the other hand, on the other extreme, you have companies for whom, and we see this playing out with the European auto sector. Why has there been a pushback against some of the EV tariffs? It's because there's a market at stake for some of those players, right? So that's the other end of it, which they have to contend with. So, Mike, there isn't really sort of a one answer to it. I think it's a spectrum on how sensitive they are to the policy. I will say this, though, that what many companies do grapple with, and I think many policymakers are grappling with too, is if level one was to go from, okay, we are in a world of connectedness to we need to actually have resilience in certain areas, including through industrial policy, I think the next phase is going to be how do you translate policies on paper into action? And that runs into things like skill, that runs into things like energy and infrastructure. Frankly, that runs into, has the government placed the right bet in the right sector, right? And I don't just see that as a question of the US or Australia. I mean, I spent a lot of time in markets in Southeast Asia. There's a scramble across Southeast Asia to be the next in queue to do assembly testing and packaging in semiconductors to build prefabs. But even as these countries are scrambling, oftentimes with encouragement from the US and others, there is a real question for them about, do we have the capacity to execute on the industrial policy that we have put down on paper? So for businesses, even when they are looking to align particularly with a particular policy, there's the question of, can this deliver, and are we well positioned? And so then that turns into a bit of a conversation with businesses about, well, there's an element of you being shaped by the environment, but what is your role and voice to shape the policy environment and to help policymakers think through some of these trade-offs more critically? Obviously, you have industry associations that put out papers. But again, as people who came out of Washington and a national security lens, frankly speaking, this is a new discipline for national security professionals. I mean, many of them could probably write the first 3 sentences of the memo, and then you get further down, and how do you start breaking down a semiconductor and all? I'm not trying to say that there isn't real talent in different governments, but this mindset of thinking about economic statecraft, when I was in the Obama administration, the sum total of economic statecraft was really TPP, and we're no longer in that. And then it's now all of a sudden a whole new world. You couldn't really have conversations about Belt and Road and infrastructure because the Japanese would be raising those kinds of points. But the world has shifted today, and I think there's still more evolution for even policymakers. And now I'm slipping into my former USG hat in terms of the toolkit, the muscles, the ability, the data, the fact base to be able to deliver on some of the policies. And I come back to that question of, are the right bets being made? That's something that business is grappling with. Frankly, I think many governments are too.
Before I came here, I was running Asian studies at Georgetown University. We had a joint degree we were starting with the business school. And the School of Foreign Service, national security, foreign policy experts sat down with the business school professors to design their curriculum. We were all very excited. And the business school professor said, we're really keen to tell our students how national security affects profits, business, and markets. And then we said, we're really keen to tell our students how business affects national security. And just creating the framework and the pedagogy was, as you said, it was a new discipline. We're product placement. We're doing an executive education course now with the business school at University of Sydney, and the pedagogy of how you teach this or explain this is a new discipline. It's interdisciplinary, but it is a new melding of tools that scholars and policymakers and businesses have not combined very often. Alan, I want to come back to you now. As we heard from Ziad, one of the things businesses was wondering is, can government deliver on some of these industrial policies, on some of the economic security policies? The former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating had a line you may know where he said about industrial policy, we can't trust these people in government to fill out their travel vouchers. How are they going to design a chips industry or a car company? And there's a famous, Reagan administration line, I don't care whether companies do potato chips or microchips, let the market decide and so forth. You sound a bit skeptical, but have we reached sort of optimal performance from government? Or have we gone too far? Do you think we're evolving in a way where governments, despite your very appropriate concern, where governments can actually deliver in the way that Ziad says?
I certainly don't think we've reached peak performance. I think they're well short of what they could be doing, and this is one of the problems, right? I had a couple of stints in Washington as well, and some very wise person said to me early on, it's incumbent on you whenever you suggest any policy in Washington, not just to think, is this a good policy, but will this still be a good policy once Congress has got hold of it, right? And the policy-making mechanisms, for reasons I was talking about before, in all of, certainly in the US and the EU, are not particularly well designed. One of the problems with the US is the US is trying to do a lot of stuff, as in sort of the equivalent of socialism in one country, right, behind walls. It is trying to build an EV industry behind one wall. They're not just trying to do that themselves, they're convinced everyone else can do it as well, right? And they're actually using somewhat coercive techniques to try and get the EU to adopt US-type views, particularly to do with carbon pricing, this sort of thing, right? So they're talking the language of friend-shoring, the language of alliances. And I think what would actually help a lot with industrial policies is if, particularly the US and the EU, recognized that certainly under the Biden administration, you have a administration there that actually has the right instincts on alliance building, on foreign policy, and on climate, right, certainly compared with the predecessor. But it can do things in certain ways that the EU can't. it has fiscal capacity that the EU Germany will not let the EU have fiscal capacity. It is prepared to use trade in that way that the EU can't. Meanwhile, the EU can do stuff, namely carbon pricing, which is a gigantically important thing that it doesn't look directly like national security, but it absolutely determines the way that all of these industries like EVs and so forth are developed, which the US can't do. To give the Democrats their due, they did try to get carbon pricing through Congress on multiple occasions and failed. That's why they're doing it this different way. And basically, I think, if anything, I would like less coordination, or I would like the big powers just to back off each other and recognize they are doing the best they can. They're going to rub up against each other in some unpleasant ways. Some American companies will have to pay carbon tariffs. They won't be very high into the EU, but they each should try and stop coercing the other to try and do things their way. And this absolutely goes both ways. When the US announced the Inflation Reduction Act, these infamous electric vehicle tax credits, which were really quite a small proportion of the overall spending, in European eyes, assume these gigantic totemic importance. Emmanuel Macron went across to Washington, and depending on which translation of the French you look at, said, this risks fracturing the West, quote unquote, this risks fracturing the West. Like, come on. The Protestant Reformation, right, that fractured the West, right? The Napoleonic Wars, they fractured the West, right? Some local content requirements in electric vehicle and tax credits, which they managed to punch holes in anyway through getting a leasing loophole and so forth. That has not fractured the West. So this is it. You all do what you can with the mechanisms you can and the political support you can. We can't all be Australia. But I think it would help a lot if those economies which kind of are on the same side in terms of their values and where they want to get to, would recognize that there cannot be one model of doing this.
So then, Alan, how do the leading like-minded economies, although we're not as like-minded perhaps as some think, create or at least preserve parts of the old order that business does benefit from? You sounded pessimistic about the future of the WTO, for example. I think it's hard to find people in Washington who want to work on the WTO, but in Japan or Australia, and I think Korea and Singapore and elsewhere in this region, WTO is still pretty important. There are other multilateral agreements. Of course, there's TPP, CPTPP, which the US pulled out of. Is there a prospect through the G7 or some other mechanism to get some consensus on what should be preserved or perhaps reinvigorated? Or are we really done with the WTO and some of the old ways of doing business?
Well, I'm skeptical of international governance and global governance and have been for a long time. The WTO is a funny one, because one part of the WTO, right, the dispute settlement process, is actually working reasonably well, except for the US. Now, that's a gigantic exception. So, for example, if you look at what the EU announced last week with their own electric vehicle tariffs, that was not a Biden-style attempt to start a trade war. That was an attempt to start a negotiation. There might well be a WTO case because China has one ready to go. And if there is, that will be a way of structuring a negotiation in the way that the Airbus-Boeing, the much maligned Airbus-Boeing litigation was basically a way of structuring negotiation. Now, the US gave up on the WTO, and this is not a Trump innovation, right? This growing disillusion for a long time. So this is a multilateral institution which is used by certain countries and not other countries. But I don't think you can expect there is going to be one system which holds everyone together. And I'm also a bit of a skeptic about the G7, just because even if they're sort of like-minded on certain things, right, they'll coalesce around things like Russia, Ukraine. Nonetheless, the degree of coercion that the US wants to use, and the US is kind of really very strong aversion to China and having anything to do with China just isn't shared among other countries. So no, I think it's even within the advanced democracies, it is a question of sort of shifting alliances and finding areas on which they can agree and move forward. But there is not, I don't think we're going to go back to any kind of, if indeed it ever really worked, to be honest with you, any big sort of multilateral global framework.
There's no new Bretton Woods. We might reach some agreements on infrastructure financing or perhaps disciplines on export controls, but it's going to be specifics.
There is, and to be honest with you, even then, you can look back at the WTO and GATT and say, as some people do, and say, well, that was never multilateral, that was a Cold War club.
Yeah.
That was a US-run Cold War club. Big swathes of the world weren't in it.
It was a great club.
Yeah, it's great to come to be.
I miss it so. Let's see if we have questions. We have microphones roaming, and I'm going to look for hands. I'm a little bit blind up here. So let me, please, in the front row here, microphone team. Could you introduce yourself to the audience, just your name and rank and serial number?
Hi, my name is Myung-hee Yu. I'm from Seoul National University. Well, I'm not sure this is the great question for the first question, but I would like to ask Mr. Ziad Haider about the business perspectives, business perception about the economic security, because when government pursued globalization in the past, business embraced the opportunity and make the most of the framework or policies that government pursued because it was in their best interest. But in regard to economic security, there is a perception gap between businesses and governments because it affects their bottom lines. So in your experience, what are the concerns, the gravest concerns or complaints that you heard about these days economic security policies pursued by major countries from business communities? And also, what can government do to actually have more public-private partnership to have sustainable economic security policies that can actually reflect the 21st century challenges? So that's my question.
So do you want to start? You mentioned earlier that business wants government to deliver, but surely behind closed doors, there's more whinging about government than that. So what do you hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a place to start is, I mean, every business has its own economic security agenda, right? Even before the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing, I mean, the COVID itself was a shock to the system where many companies had to rethink the model of sprawling supply chains and thinking about having nearshoring, friendshoring. So for labor reasons, for pandemic-induced reasons, there was already something in the air for cost reasons, including in places like China. There was something in the air already that we have to sort of think a bit differently about our supply chains. I think that has all gotten turbocharged by this whole geopolitical overlay, where companies are, in some cases, being pushed even faster to think about it. So I think it's important to not, again, I'm very, I guess a theme in my remarks here is to just make sure we don't pull everything into one vortex, because maybe there are a few, but one might be of a bigger size there. That's one. I think in terms of, how exactly, what is it that companies want? Well, it will not surprise you. The thing that companies love more than anything else is certainty, right? And when we have these very understandably fluid definitions of economic security across governments, when we have tensions between home shoring and friendshoring, right? Forget anything else. That leads to uncertainty, and that makes it difficult for businesses to be able to make the kinds of investments they want. And frankly, going to my previous role as a policymaker, it's sometimes that ambiguity suits a purpose. Sometimes it actually is helpful to leave it a bit open-ended and force companies to jump as high as they can to hit a bar that's to be defined, right? So in that sense, I think, obviously, I used to do this a lot at the State Department as a special representative for business affairs. I'd meet regularly with businesses and communicate a point of view. I think what's interesting to think about in this day and age is that just the business person in a government, or is that more of the intelligence? And that, I guess, is in some ways a feature that's unique in Australia, that you have the part of the system that is coming to speak to business. So I think one thing that is helpful is to be clear about what are the kind of guideposts. But I think that is where it is also a conversation where, as we were saying, policymakers are also developing their capabilities to make the decisions. So for businesses to provide a point of view on what are the second order effects of this, there may not be agreement, but then at least it's a more structured conversation. So I think that is what I see to your public-private dialogue part. And I think the spirit of probably the dinner tonight in some ways is that. That's going to be quite important because there's a learning happening, frankly, on both sides, and their points of views there on both sides.
You're at the intersection, in a classic Washington think tank way, of government and the private sector. What are you hearing, Emily?
From the private sector, I mean, certainty is absolutely it. The other thing that we hear a lot is that it's really difficult for them. They know that this Geopolitical risk is out there. A lot of them are doing scenario planning around Taiwan contingencies or other likely flashpoints. And so they're getting prepared, but it's really hard for them to move if their competitors aren't moving, right? And so it's not just the certainty, but sometimes they're actually saying, if you want us to do this, you actually need to do a rulemaking. You need to tell us we need to go, otherwise we're at a competitive disadvantage. And so there's kind of this push-pull between not wanting too much regulation and not wanting to have too many constraints on them, but also kind of it's hard for them to institutionally move unless they're told to move.
We'll give you the last word for now, Alan. You spoke earlier about the intergovernmental coordination. What about public-private within economies?
I think this is absolutely right about actually there's a collective action problem, right? And I remember talking to people, to companies in the early stages of COVID, and they said, yeah, you want us to nearshore, you want us to change suppliers, you want us to do all the rest of it. It will take us 18 months or 2 years or whatever to do that. I will go bust during that time, right? I will go bust while the risk-taking company will stay alive. And so there's a suboptimal degree of risk-taking because it's not in any particular government's, company's interest to move. And I have not seen, this is not something in which I'm an expert, but I have not seen that kind of clear rulemaking, and certainly not coordination between different governments in that kind of rulemaking. What I see instead, particularly in a case like Europe, is you will have certain companies, like the German companies and so on, which still have their own relationships with government, which try to make those relationships with government, to use them in the way that they always have. And they are finding in many cases that they don't actually work that well anymore because there are many more forces in play than there were previously. One of the reasons that the EU, it's nothing like as bad as the US, but one of the reasons that the EU is miles behind on China on electric vehicles is because its companies just continued with their same relationship to government that they'd always had, changing the rules to suit themselves and not recognizing there was a much bigger change going out there beyond them.
Excellent opening, really rich, left a lot of homework for the subsequent panels. The next panel will actually feature government officials explaining respective strategies. I'll ask Haley Channer, our Director of Economic Security at the Center, to take over, but first let's thank Ziad, Emily, and Alan.